A new law has kicked in requiring news sites to be individually licensed. 10 websites are affected now, but does this spell the end of the government's light touch over the internet? Acting Minister Tan Chuan-Jin is here to take your questions. Talking Point the Vote starts now. Good evening, everybody, and welcome into Talking Point the Vote. I'm Daniel Martin. Last Tuesday, the Media Development Authority, or MDA, announced a licensing regime for online news sites. Concerns about the new rule have been loud and swift, but considering it affects only 10 sites, is it a storm in a teacup? My guests joining me tonight include Cabinet Minister Tan Chuan-Jin. We're also joined by Professor Arun Mahinan of the Institute of Policy Studies and Bertha Hansen, from the editor of the website The Breakfast Network, a collective blog. Now, many of you are aware, of course, that we originally invited MDO CEO Colin Nett to be on our show. And a lot of netizens have been asking us, Minister, how come you're on the show instead?
There's actually quite a lot of interesting theories online about why I'm here. Well, I would say that I think when we pass regulations or policies where there's quite a lot of public interest, I think it's important for the public office holders to front it. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this. I would say that it's not just really a debate and discussion about the regulations itself. I think it's really about the whole public engagement space, where people do feel that whether is that space being constrained, is it being threatened. And I think it's useful perhaps to also have a perspective about, from a non-MCI perspective, about how we look at it and how we ought to operate, not just government and people, but as a society, how should we operate that space.
What are you looking forward to answering and hearing today?
Well, I mean, obviously there are many perspectives out there from the public, so we look forward to the concerns that they raise, and actually for my fellow panelists as well. And
one of the ways that everybody has been talking to us is via, of course, our poll that's happening online at channelnewsasia.com/TP. Let's take a look at that vote right now. Will the new licensing limit online news content? Yes, 48.6%. No says 51.4%. Quite a bit more in the no column for now. Minister, I'm going to take quick responses. Where would you vote, yes or no?
No.
No for you. Arun, how about yourself?
Maybe.
Maybe. Option C, the invisible. Bertha?
Yes.
You'd say a yes for you?
Yeah.
All right. So we've got 3 more votes. We can't add you in yes yet. We need you to log on and vote next time. Let's talk a little bit about our discussion. The first thing that I want to talk a little bit about is a quick look at what the new rule is all about. Let's find out more.
These are the 10 news websites that come under the new licensing framework. They have over 50,000 unique visitors each month and publish at least 1 news article a week. Licensees have to follow certain guidelines on content. For example, nothing that incites racial and religious hatred, promotes violence, or advocates homosexuality. Cross that line and the article will have to be removed within 24 hours. According to the Media Development Authority, blogs and personal commentaries on Singapore matters don't count as news and therefore are not included in the framework. In any case, all online content is already subject to existing laws on defamation and sedition.
A look at what some of the new regulations are all about. Minister, your response to that, do you think that in light of what we understand of it so far, are online critics who have been very vocal overreacting to it?
Well, I think a lot depends on individuals' perspective about the internet space. Some will feel that that space is a place that you shouldn't touch. So whether it's a light touch or heavy touch, I think some will feel that you should not regulate it at all. I actually think that you can't actually regulate the space. The internet is there. I think you can't regulate it. But the question is whether should you have some form of, should you be able to manage in some ways. I would say that actually this whole space has evolved considerably. You can't turn back the clock. I think it's an integral part of society. I would say that a big plus in the social media space is that a lot of more people are able to air their views, air their concerns. And I think that's something that we should not restrain. And I think that's something that we have to come to terms with. I think not just government, but I think as a society. So the concerns that people have, I can understand. They feel that, is their space going to be constrained? Will they be able to continue to say what they want to say? My perspective is that I think it's fair game to air your views. I think you should. You have criticisms about policies, about government. I think you are free to carry on.
It's a very personal space. It's on my phone, it's on my computer, it's in my living room.
Especially
it's
smartphones.
My space.
I think that's made a lot of difference in terms of access to the whole internet space as well.
Bertha, Aaron, your views, do you think people, online netizens, have been overreacting?
Given the first statement, it's entirely understandable why they reacted that way, because there was not enough clarity. Of course, over the next 2 days was greater clarity. But even then, this is a space, as the Minister said, it's not only new, but somewhat sacred in the sense that the old mainstream media space has been bottled up for a very, very long time. So people who have come into space don't want the same thing to happen again. So that is part of the narrative, This is the fear that, and it's also kind of be seen as a slippery slope. You take one step and then the next steps will follow. And there is a pattern in all of these things. So that's why I don't find it extraordinarily, it is understandable.
Understandable. Bertha, something that Dr. Yaacob said today, I want the online community to understand this is not an attempt to clamp down on anybody. It's really to ensure that those in the business of reporting news do so responsibly. Do you think this sets fears at ease?
Well, I think the problem is the way the government has proceeded to launch this licensing scheme. In the first place, it is seen as a constraint on the internet space because the internet community hasn't been consulted on it prior to it. So it makes a little monkey out of the, the whole transparency and public engagement exercise that the government is so hot about. If you can't even engage the most vocal parts of the community, and you proceed to just throw this down on them, and of course, they will look at it as an attempt to clamp down on freedom of expression. Minister,
what do you think about that? I mean, a lot of netizens have also said, just like what Bertha said, there's been no public consultation.
Well, for one, I think as a whole, we are stepping up engagement actually on a wide range of issues. I think on this particular issue, we see the introduction of the regulations. It's actually not anything specifically new. The regulations are in existence. It deals with the news print media space. But that space has moved on. Actually, it's moved on for a number of years now. And what we realize is that you have print media, which is being managed in a particular way, but you have even their own companies actually having online versions, which are not managed in the same way. So basically, what we've done is to update that. So from our perspective, I think it's an updating of regulations. It's not a fundamental shift. There's no major shift.
So it doesn't warrant consultation?
No, I think regulations is something that governments do. We pass regulations. But for example, I mean, we have also talked about next year, for example, looking at the Broadcasting Act. Now, that potentially would have major shifts, so shifts of directions. I think that's something that we need to engage, we need to debate a lot more substantively, and that's something we plan to do. So regulations are being passed on a range of issues. Whether in hindsight, whether more consultation and dialogue on this specific regulation should have been put in place. But we saw it as refreshing existing regulations and putting it in place.
If it's refreshing regulations, do you think that therefore that's why it doesn't require consultation?
I think there are regulations and there are regulations. In this case, the regulations concern freedom of expression, and this is a very critical issue to the internet community. So I wouldn't say that this would be one of those regulations that you can just gazette.
No. So I think that's a fair comment. In fact, I would say that actually a lot of the public concern revolves around I think not just regulations, but is my space being constrained?
Correct.
Can I continue to say what I want to say? Could I still air my views? Could I still post my comments? If I'm critical, would I be constrained? And I would say my message is that quite clearly you should carry on. And I think we would be poorer for it. We'd be deprived Singaporeans of that space, which is why this space actually is quite precious. Because I think traditionally you may not have that access. But social media now allows individuals to actually air their views. And I think we should protect that. Yeah. I think as a society, I think we would actually lose out if we were to actually...
Which is why if it was really a question of updating and just bringing in one additional player, which is Yahoo, all the other players are well known to Singapore. They are actually part of the mainstream offline media. So there's really nothing new. And the grey area was Yahoo had come into this space through the back door, as many people observed. And then you can say you are now regularizing it. You are now including them as part of the same regulated media. But the problem came up because of the lack of clarity.
I want to talk about that list of 10. That's been another issue that a lot of people have been posting questions about. But before we move on, I want to come back to this idea of consultation. Joining us on the phone lines right now at 66910028, NCMP for the Workers' Party, Gerald Giam, joins us as well. Gerald.
Hi, Daniel. Hi. Thanks for having me on the phone. Hello, Minister. It's good to talk to you.
Hello, good evening. We've been talking a lot about this lack of public discourse, if you would. Some people have said the WP have been very quiet on this as well.
Well, I think we have our views on this, and I understand that these rules have been made under the subsidiary legislation. So although it can be justified legally, I'm concerned that the government is making such an immediate and controversial change to the rules, and which potentially affect our fundamental freedoms. And this was done without first consulting the public or Parliament even. So I'm of the view that this change should have been tabled for debate in Parliament, and there should have been a public engagement to obtain the feedback before the decision was made.
Gerald, do you have a question for our panel?
Well, I would like to ask actually the Minister, I mean, now regarding the actual changes, I understand the objective is to bring the online news regulations in line with the regulations for print and broadcast media.
That's right.
However, many of the regulations for the mainstream media are already too restrictive in my opinion. So now these onerous restrictions are being extended to the online space. So, Minister, is the government's intent then to control the online space, like how it controls the mainstream media?
Gerald, thanks for joining us on air. It feels like Ask Minister, doesn't it, sir? What's your response to that?
Well, the intent is not to control the online space. Firstly, I don't think that's possible, nor should we try. I think it's a futile effort, and I think you should respect that space. I think what we are doing really is to address the news sites. As I mentioned, we have existing policies, regulations with regards to print media. But that space has moved on. 1/3 of Singaporeans actually consume the news online. But the regulations don't provide for that. And basically what we've done is to bring that regulations into that space. But what is probably foremost on people's minds is really in terms of content. As I mentioned earlier, can we say what we want to say? Can we still read what we want to read? I would say that the regulations do not prevent that. I think what we are asking for is a certain level of responsibility for those who are reporting news. And essentially, it pretty much is already governed by some of the existing sort of regulations and understanding on that space. So the question now is that, does it prevent us? And that's where typically we associate the space in online, where we can really say a lot of things that we want to say, be critical. And I think that hasn't changed.
Can you really establish parity, though? I mean, is that realistic?
No,
They're so different animals.
I think it's different. I think even online it's very hard to define very precisely where the lines start and where it ends. But as with all spaces, I think we feel that as far as reporting news is concerned, I think you do need some form of a light regulation and light touch. And I think we are keeping it that way.
Gerald, your view on that?
Well, I think the point about the need to regulate things like hate speech and incitement of violence, I think that there's a good argument to be made for that. But if that is what the government wants to regulate, then why not just focus the legislation on regulating that, rather than leaving the definition so broad to include all Singapore news?
I've got a little bit of time. Quick response, sir.
No, well, I think we are regulating sites that are reporting on Singapore news, which is why some of these sites have been identified. But the rest of the blogs, the rest of the sites that are commenting and sharing perspectives, they are not part of that regulation.
We're going to talk more about certain views and voices that have come up online. Plus, we're going to continue taking your tweets at TP Vote. Keep tweeting us and calling us at 66910028. The discussion will continue after the break. We've left. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for staying with us on Talking Point The Vote. The new licensing rule has stirred up a storm of controversy. One point of contention, how the news was communicated. What started as a press release on Tuesday was followed by several clarifications from the authorities. And finally, a meeting with reporters this morning by Information Minister Yaacob Ibrahim. We're going to take your views and opinions in just a moment. But I do want to remind you, don't call and vote. Vote online at channelnewsasia.com/TP. That's where you go to vote. call us with your views at 669-10028 and tweet us at TPVote. Alrighty, that's the way to do it, everybody. Let's go to the poll right now and where it's standing. Will the new licensing rule limit online news content? That's the question we've been asking you online. And yes, it holds the majority for now. 57.3% are saying yes, 42.7% are saying no. We're getting a lot of votes, so keep voting and keep those points coming through. Minister, I understand that you had a little bit of an... you want to add on?
Just a quick response, I think, to the question about parliamentary debates. I think in terms of governance, the law has been passed. So that's where the debate has taken place. Regulations are being passed on a regular basis, I think, on a range of issues. I think when there's a major shift and a change in law, I think that's where we go back to Parliament and we debate that. So as I mentioned earlier, where the Broadcasting Act, where we're looking at perhaps effecting some changes next year, that's where a full-scale debate will take place. But in this instance, I think members of Parliament are free to raise the issues to be debated in Parliament as well.
Dorothy, you had a quick response to that?
Yeah, basically, I don't understand this business about parliamentary debate. Essentially, what has been done is it's been done without any kind of consultation even prior to that. We don't need to convene Parliament to discuss this. You could just talk to some of us. And that wasn't even done. So the other thing is, I think the Minister has said a great deal about freedom of speech and how there's no constraints, say what you like, you know, and all that. I mean, that's all well and good. The fact is, the definition of news sites has been framed so broadly that a lot of things could come under it. And then the government's position is not clear. You say 10 sites only, okay, that's the beginning. 2 days, 3 days later, you say bloggers are exempted. And then after that, what comes next? So basically, there's no clarity. We're living in this uncertain area.
That's causing a lot of anxiety, maybe, for online citizens. Are you getting that feeling from fellow online bloggers and news sites, maybe?
Yes,
You're hearing
it is.
that?
I think what matters here is trust, yeah? People don't think that the government will stick to just 10 sites.
Aaron?
I think, if I may just add on to what Bhatt has said, it's the way the legislation is drafted is so broad. I mean, it says something like any report on social, economic, political, cultural, artistic, etc., on any other aspect of Singapore. Was there a need for this kind of blunderbuss legislation, or could it have been drafted more precisely?
Well, as I mentioned, the wordings of the regulations, these are in existence today. We didn't add on to it in a specific way. So, like I said, essentially what it does is to bring on to effect the regulations to the online versions. But what is probably, like I said, most of concern to people is actually content. Are we able to, what governs the content? What can be said? Even if you're brought online as a news site, are you able to report, as you did before? Are you able to report critical pieces? That remains applicable. In fact, if you look at the way it's unfolded, I mean, we have also shared that from 96 till now, we have actually used it very lightly. Comments that are political, comments that are critical remains untouched, and that should be so. But comments which we feel are unsuitable, for example, where it's racially or from a religious perspective, inflammatory, always hate speech involved, and we have seen some of these examples. I think that's where MDA would probably step in. But I think in most cases, criticisms, comments, views from Singaporeans,
but
they remain valid.
Have the power to step in, and which they have done.
Yes.
So why
there are
is this
existing rules in place, the Broadcasting Act and whatnot.
So why was the need to start licensing the cyberspace? You said parity. It could be achieved the other way around too. Yeah, for the news sites instead of licensing the cyberspace news sites.
Netizens have brought up examples. You can publish clarifications, you can publish retractions, do things like that.
In fact, I want to take up what the Minister said earlier. He says that we can look at how to manage this in other ways. See, that is the point of consultation. If you came and talked to some people, then maybe we could come up with some other ways. Your concern must be responsible reporting, I suppose, right? Responsible freedom of expression. That could be done in other ways. The trouble is when you start saying that you should be on a par with mainstream media, people think of on a par as what Professor Arun said, bottled up.
In a different context, your response?
No, I would say it's actually quite different. I think online media is actually very different from print media. All we're asking is that if you're reporting on news, there's a certain level of responsibility. Actually, what the regulations bring on board really is the licensing. And I think the ability to communicate to the companies to take down on news, say within 24 hours, which previously we didn't have. And which is something I think of particular concern for online news. But the rest of it, where it's governed by, in terms of the space for what content you can carry, I think, as we mentioned earlier, many of us agree that some of these things actually should not be, perhaps not be acceptable. But the rest of the space, which is where people are concerned with their views, criticisms, alternative views, I think that remains valid. And
why not rely on the existing frameworks like the NPPA or the Broadcasting Act?
No, so the difference is that I think what we're bringing to bear is for those sites that are reporting news, we have already mainstream print media being regulated, but a large part of actually news is being generated online, even by some of the same companies. But the rules have not been updated, so essentially that's what's happening.
Okay.
But the rest of the space,
would you consider the other way around? In
terms
sort
of
of deregulating the mainstream media, which has shown tremendous responsibility over the last half a century.
Let's talk about
So
the
why
idea of
haven't they
ethical
earned it?
responsibility in a moment.
Yes.
I just want to take a quick phone call before we continue. 66910028. Our next caller is standing by. Hi, what's your name?
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Madi.
Hi, Madi. What is your question today?
Well, actually, I don't understand why is that there should be a regulation, a restriction there, especially, we Singaporeans, generally, we know where we stand, really, you know what I mean. So on another aspect of it, I think it will be more provocative if there's this kind of regulations and all right? Because as a blogger, sometimes when I see this kind of notices and all this kind, sometimes I don't even feel like reading it. So, especially the racial, I think our minister here, Mr. Tan, is more concerned on the racial aspect, and religious aspect of it, if I'm not mistaken. On that aspect, nobody would, some might there, but not many, all right? Just for the few of these people, we just can't restrict on this.
Right, so you're saying that the reader, him or herself, can take that position. Madi, thank you so much for raising your view with us. Roy joins us right now at 6691-0028. Roy, hello.
Hello.
Hi, you're on the air. Your question or comment, go ahead.
Yes, I just would like to ask, why the need to so-called update these licensing issues, this news licensing, when we already have existing laws such as Sedition Act or Maintenance of Harmony Act to deal with this kind of racial insights that might happen?
We have other legislation in place already. Roy, thank you very much, Minister.
Yes.
Well, as mentioned earlier, I think this is regarding to news sites.
Reiteration.
It has changed. News sites, in terms of print media, has been regulated, but a lot of it has moved online as well. I think that's how we see it. But I want to reiterate again, the rest of the sites, the rest of the comments, how people articulate their views, I think that remains open. That hasn't changed.
I think what people need is basically something more explicit than a general approach, which leaves open to further changes down the line. So basically, if you are saying that readers' comments are not touched, bloggers are not touched, and all that, then it should be written into the regulations as well.
We know that there was a posting on the Facebook page, but part of the problem for the MDA,
posting on the
yes, but part of the
Facebook
problem
page.
is it's not ensconced in the actual wording of the regulations.
Because actually, in terms of the regulations, in terms of content, actually we have spelled out what are those areas which are deemed not so acceptable. But it doesn't cover the political commentaries, it doesn't cover individual perspectives, and that remains a very wide space.
I disagree with that. I disagree with that because, the objectionable content also relates to, matters that is said to disturb national harmony, public order, and, basically...
So how do we draw the line?
Who defines all that, So
the
basically that is the
interpretation
problem.
is left primarily to
the regulators.
And I think that is a legitimate concern.
It's a legitimate concern, but I think it's also useful to look at how it has been translated into reality. So we see how MDA has approached. The proliferation of sites today. Many comments, many are very critical. For example, with this ongoing regulations debate, many are very critical about it. But those remain valid, and they are not subjected to take down.
Madi brought up the fact that as the reader, I can discern for myself sometimes.
Yes, they do.
Look at the Amy Cheong incident where she had left certain comments and netizens responded to that. Sometimes it can be that sense of self-policing.
That's what they call community moderation. There are enough intelligent and responsible people in the cyberspace.
And there will be.
It has been demonized, unfortunately, a little too much, I think, that it gives the impression that the Wild Wild West cyberspace is the only cyberspace that we have.
No, in fact,
but we have a very responsible people.
I think the community responds, and we have seen them responding. But what it allows is for the authorities to also manage that in terms of asking them to take down, because in some cases, it can be inflammatory. There'll be those that react, in fact, I would say majority react responsibly. But there'll also be those that may react in a different way. And sometimes it sparks off a dynamic of its own. So I think the recognition is community is responsible. A lot of them are pushing back. But I think it also allows authorities to at least deal with those issues when they crop up as well.
But those who react irresponsibly are not those lists of 10. So basically, you know, so the question is, when are you going to extend that list of 10, which is actually very mainstream, to those whom you deem are not acting responsibly? So, and the other question is this, when you talk about other ways and all that, and I'm glad the caller talked about how, you know, netizens, some of them are, most of them, or us, are intelligent enough to suss out for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. And I think some form of self-policing could be left to ourselves to do. For example, if you want parity with mainstream media, you know, I mean, I wouldn't object to Breakfast Network giving anybody the right of reply. That would be one. I mean, that would definitely ensure responsible reporting because you have to take comments.
Would other bloggers feel the same way? I wonder.
I can't speak for them.
Yeah, no,
I
in
can't
fact,
speak for them.
IPS, we did research on this subject. Surprisingly to many people, that each of the major sites has its own code of practice, code of conduct, code of engagement. So, you know, that's why the other idea of having a universal code of conduct never found any traction with this community, because each one feels that they want to and they can act responsibly. I wonder whether the government should really move away from a nanny state mode to a new position where it trusts the citizenry. It gives them the chance to do it right. When they don't do it right, you can move in. And in the Singapore context, you can move in very swiftly and very decisively. You have enough reserve powers with so many other pieces of legislation. So people are wondering, why this?
Let's get your quick response, sir, before we go for a break.
In fact, I think the space remains open. I fully recognize that there are responsible players online as well. But I think many people in society are also concerned. You have cyberbullying, you have people posting hate postings, and for example, or targeting individuals, putting out the details online. There's a whole range of behaviors. At the end of it, I think we also need to discuss, and this is not the subject of this particular regulation, but that's something eventually we need to discuss.
But does a regulation like this hint that we are a nanny state, do you think?
No, I think what it identifies is really with regards to news sites who are reporting. And I think we feel, and that's where perhaps we might disagree, that there ought to be a certain level of responsibility when it comes to reporting news.
Where do you lie on this? Obviously, everybody wants to read responsibly and read responsible materials. Do you think that this regulation will help you do that? Or do you think it might hint at a nanny state as has been brought up? Keep calling us, and we'll also be talking to prominent blogger Ravi Philemon when Talking Point returns after a short break. Stay with us. We're back on Talking Point, the vote. Thanks for your tweets that have kept on coming in at TP Vote. Keep sending them in. We've also got our poll running. Head on over to channelnewsasia.com/TP and vote right now. Our question is, will the new licensing rule limit online news content? The majority are now saying yes. 66.9% are saying yes. Earlier on, it was 47%. So more are swaying towards the yes. Arun, why do you think more are saying yes now?
I hope it is the persuasion of the arguments here.
And more people logging on and voting, perhaps, indeed. Yes. You know, we've got more calls coming in. We're going to Ravi Philemon, who's a blogger, joining us at 669-10028. Ravi?
Hi, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Talk to us about your question.
Hello, Minister Arun and Bertha. I have a question for the Minister. I think most bloggers would agree that some regulation for the Internet is important. I would like to ask how the regulations before they were changed so inadequate that it had to be updated so draconianly, without consultation, without debate in Parliament? And also, are there instances in the past where sites are asked to take down something and they did not comply within a stipulated time frame to do so?
Thank you, Ravi. We've discussed a lot of your question in the earlier segments, actually. So I'm going to go to the second part of your question, which is other sites who have not responded to taking down. Do you know if that has been handled or happened?
I think by and large, when MDA has stepped in, most of the sites have responded. So I think that has taken place.
Okay, we know that it was announced today that since 1996, there have been something like 24 cases. The most recent was in the last 2 years where there's only been one case. That particular video of innocence of Muslims, I believe it was called, that was taken down. Just that one in the last 2 years. If you've got a question, call in at 6691-0028. Don't forget, watch the show. We usually address some of your questions, so don't repeat the questions if we've already covered it, all right? Let's talk a little bit about this idea of communication and how this was communicated. Netizens have also been talking about whether this was a mistake or whether there could have been improvements in the way this regulation was communicated to members of the public. Minister Yaacoob's comment in a recent BBC interview said that the aim of the new licensing rule was to ensure Singaporeans read the right thing. We have the quote for you right here on my iPad screen. It says, really, at the end of the day, what we want to do here is to protect the interests of ordinary Singaporeans. As long as they go to online news sites to read the news, I think it's important for us to make sure that they read the right thing. Insofar as what has transpired yesterday, if there's an event, if it's reported accurately, this was said by so-and-so, and what have you, basically. Arun, what did you take from this quote, this statement when you heard it?
If you look at the 10 sites and you ask the editors of those 10 sites, they would not need the minister to remind them of that. That's what they do day in and day out, to do the right thing.
Responsible journalism.
Absolutely. I mean, the 9 of them are the mainstream media of Singapore, and Yahoo is the only new player in this. So that's why it the same question keeps running. Why? Why now? Why did you feel so compelled to introduce this in such a unholy haste?
A lot of people saying that there's been no tipping point per se.
Yes.
Minister, your response, why now?
There's no particular tipping point, but as we mentioned, I think the space has been evolving actually in the last few years. Actually, the regulations largely deal with the print media, but online news sites, I think that hasn't really evolved. So we felt it was time to actually refresh that. But I would say that specifically, is there a particular tipping point? Are the news sites reporting things that are, as you mentioned, irresponsibly? Not particularly so.
Were you afraid that there may be other new foreign players who may not be as responsible as we have seen in UK? And Rupert Murdoch's empire has not always been the best examples of journalism. So are you afraid that others might come in and that's why you are preempting this?
It will grow. We don't see it receding. And there is always a possibility that there will be foreign players that will come in and report news locally. So I think the refreshing of these regulations to capture online news sites, I think in part also addresses that challenge.
Don't you think you'll be playing catch-up all the time then? Essentially, you do this now with 10 sites, then I gather you will do things with sites that are on foreign servers. And today, I believe something was said too about sites which are foreign sites, which
so that's
cater
the
to
basis.
local news.
That's right. So that's where I think we're looking next year in terms of the Broadcasting Act. What are some of the things that we might want to review? And that's something I think we would have to actually talk to the community and see how we should evolve that space.
I just want to take some calls first. I know we've got a lot to say on this, but we've got Harold who's been holding on very patiently at 66910028. Harold, hello.
Hi, good day.
Hi, thanks for joining us. Your question, Harold.
Yeah, I have this question, right? Why is it framed so broadly that it could, at one point, you could include more sites? Because the way it's framed as a regulation, it seems that the scope is very wide and it's very big.
Right, okay, the broad scope of the wording. Thank you, Harold. I've got another caller standing by. Hello.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, SP, is it?
Yes, yeah. If I could just read the government's mind of licensing this news website.
SP, I'm going to need you to step away from your television. You're too close. There's feedback.
The onus of content falls into the hands of the website owners.
There's a lot of echo and reverb going on. Yeah. But I understand. Let's talk a little bit about Harold's question, the idea of the broad scope. Let's talk about that. Minister?
I think we discussed that earlier.
Yeah.
I think with regards to what constitutes a news site. I think there are two parts. What constitutes a news site? I think going forward, I think there possibly could be new news sites being involved. But I would say that the crux of the matter, and which I think is a concern of most Singaporeans, is actually whether the content, are we allowed to still speak up? Are we still allowed to report news which may be critical, alternative views? I think that remains acceptable.
There's been talk about whether these regulations...
I do that $50,000.
The $50,000 bond to be put up. is that going to limit perhaps small startups from starting community-based blogs?
I think there are different arrangements that MDA can work out, I think, with the different setups. I think those are details. For example, when we talk about whether this is going to come in place 1st June. I mean, essentially what has happened is that actually MDA is actually discussing with the rest of the companies how actually this is going to evolve. And so I think they'll be taking about the next 2 to 3 months to work out the details.
Okay, we've definitely got more to talk about this. We want to come back. How will the new licensing rule affect how you access content online? We'll be right back on Talking Point The Vote. Welcome back, everybody, to Talking Point The Vote. I'm Daniel Martin. We're into our last segment of the program. I know many of you have been calling in and are on hold. Please hold on. We'll come to your calls as soon as we can. We're getting a lot of calls. Minister, was this situation of how it was communicated a communications disaster? Some people have been talked about how quickly it was done and perhaps the wording and the fact that some things were clarified at different points. Was it a communications disaster?
Well, I think in hindsight, more details should have probably come up earlier. I think when some of the details were not addressed up front in the initial release, I think people began to speculate and think, is it so all-encompassing? And most importantly, is that this is censorship, and therefore I'm not going to be able to say what I want to say. I'm not going to be able to post what I want to post. But the truth of the matter is, I think this engagement space cannot be regulated in that way. I think we can't turn the clock back. In fact, I think we should embrace it. As part of the whole engagement, I think both of government with the people and people with people, I think you have to accept that that's part of that. And you need to allow people to articulate their views, because I think we will be shortchanged if we actually don't have that. So that uncertainty, I think, probably happened as a result of perhaps not all the details coming forward. So I think in hindsight, perhaps more of these details could have been presented from the onset. So at least it will allay some of the concerns. There will be other concerns and there will be other issues that we'll continue to debate, but at least it allows some of that clarity to be put forward much earlier.
Speaking of articulating your views, our viewers are voting on our poll. Will the new licensing rule limit online news content? Yes has sailed ahead in the majority. 71.7% are now saying yes, 28.3% saying no. When the show started, about 47% were saying yes. So more on the yes for now. Keep voting, of course, all throughout the program. We've got Eddie standing by at 669-10028. Hi, Eddie.
Yeah, hello.
You're on the air, Eddie. Go ahead with your question, please.
The question for the Minister. As mentioned earlier, we have all the acts and regulation already in place to cover any abuse. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what is one incident that happened recently that our current acts or regulation are unable to cover it?
And that's why, okay, thank you very much, Eddie. Was there something that our current acts were not able to cover?
I think it's related to the earlier point, whether there's a particular tipping point which sparked this move. I would say no.
So no is to the response to that question. So that our current acts are sufficient?
I think our current acts allow us to take a series of actions. But I think with regards to news sites, I think we feel that, particularly for news sites, I think there needs to be a certain level of responsibility. Most of them have exercised that. I think what we have done is I think with the change is that there's more specific responsibility imposed on the news sites. And secondly, I think it also allows for government to ask the sites to take down particular postings within 24 hours. And what kind of posts, as we mentioned earlier, would be those that we've described earlier. But as far as views, criticisms, alternatives, perspectives, those remain, and those could remain online. It's not a problem.
Do you think that the existence of these regulations could let existing news sites have a little bit of uncomfort or discomfort with what they're going to report or how they're going to report?
Well, I would say that actually existing news sites should continue to report as they've been reporting. I think they should be encouraged to air their views, critical or otherwise, and that should not change.
Will it change for you as a consumer of the news? We've got our next caller standing by. Christina, hello.
Hi, good evening. Daniel, yes. Thank you. I want to comment that, I agree with the caller that says that I want to read the right things. Yeah, because I have seen sites where there's news content. I find that, I'm firstly quite appalled by it. And secondly, I feel that if I want to go to a news site, I really want to see that there's some responsibility on the part of the giver, the writer, and the sites. And
so, Christina, if you know that this is a regulated, licensed site, will that make you feel better as a consumer when you go there?
Yes, some comfort level, yes. Yes, certainly, that will be comfort level for me.
All right, Christina, thank you so much for joining us.
I'd like to trust the site, yeah.
Thank you very much. Bertha, your quick response. People want to see, and maybe the licensing will help.
So basically, we should be licensing more sites?
Would it help the majority of consumers?
I don't think so, but because basically my argument still holds. What really is the government intent behind it? I think it's, from what I've heard from the minister, he's talking about cyberbullying, other things and other practices which is not practiced by the 10 sites, you know, and is practiced elsewhere.
Let's come back to that idea, the idea of will it expand beyond the 10 sites?
Right.
Minister, do you foresee that it would?
No, I think it is really aimed at sites that are reporting news in Singapore. Rest of the sites, which are personal blogs, commentaries, I think that's something that we feel...
No, let's say, for example, if there is a video that's circulating, right, and it isn't run on those 10 sites. It's run on every other site. Then what are you going to do? The 10 sites are perfectly all right.
Because they're not licensed?
No, because they're licensed and they're not doing anything wrong.
Right, the others are not licensed.
Yeah, the others are not licensed and they're circulating all around. So
do we rely on existing regulation in that case?
There is a case in point. TOC has specifically asked the question. They run news. They've hit the 50,000 and gone way beyond. Why aren't they licensed?
Well, NDA has looked at them specifically and felt that at this point in time, I mean, they're not a new site to be regulated.
But it didn't make it clear that you are not, a licensing target.
They're not part of the 10 sites. Over time, will there be new sites? I think there might be more new sites that come online, and I think when that happens, MDA will
I think that's the problem, right? I mean, they think they're a new site. You don't think they're a new site. So who is deciding what's a new site?
Who is a new site in that sense?
Yeah.
What if you're hosted overseas on an overseas server, for example?
So that's something that we have to address, and that's why I mentioned that I think the bigger shift that we need to look at is actually in terms of the whole Broadcasting Act. That's something that we're looking at next year, and that's something that we have to look with the different players, the different perspectives. How do we actually manage that space? Because it is complex, and there are people that are hosting news from overseas sites. How do you actually manage it? I'm not even sure whether you...
Is it a futile attempt? I want to talk about the complexities.
There will be some areas which actually, like I mentioned earlier, I think the internet is a space you cannot control.
Yes.
I think you wouldn't be able to be successful. But whether do you have a light touch in terms of regulating some space of it? And for us, we think that sites that are reporting news warrants that. But the rest of it, as of now, we don't think that that should be part of that landscape.
I'm going to take some back-to-back calls, everybody. Francis first. Hi, Francis. Francis,
Hello,
you're on the air. Hi.
It was raised just now that Mr. Yaacob was saying that in the interview with the BBC that we should be given the right news, specifically the right news. So who is going to determine the right news? I find it somewhat objectionable in some ways that somebody has to determine for me what the right news is. Shouldn't I be the one to determine what the right news is? If I don't like something, if I don't like a blog, I should just avoid it. If I like something, I should just continue to look at it. Why should there be any licensing scheme to tell me what to do? I find that very, very uncomfortable.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to go to our next caller who's standing by as well. Go ahead, Prashant.
Yeah, so my point is basically saying that it's all about the government's prerogative, and if tomorrow something goes wrong, all the citizens basically look up to the government to set the things right. So in a way, the government is doing the right thing by regulating this, because tomorrow, if anything goes wrong, just for an example, this SMRT strike, some negative view on this site, and if something would have gone wrong, everybody would have looked at the government saying that, why didn't you do it earlier?
Hindsight is 2020, isn't it?
If it's taking a proactive step already.
Thank you very much, Prashant. I understand that you're for the regulations in that sense, so for and against on both sides of the fence there. Minister, your quick response in terms of, I know what to read, don't tell me what to read.
I do accept the fact that Singaporeans would have to exercise their own judgment as to what sites they want to read, and there are many, many sites online. I think what we're saying is that for sites that are reporting news, I think that's a requirement that we're putting on them. But the rest of the sites, I think that's free for people. And many of the sites offer commentaries, perspectives as well. But I think what we're just saying is that for news sites, I think we do expect a basic level of responsibility there.
Okay. I want to come to your point, Arun, which is the idea that, you know, how it's such a wide medium. Yeah. What do you want to ask Minister about that?
Well, the fundamental point about internet is it is no respecter of national boundaries or national laws. we can easily cross these boundaries, and if there is a persistent or a recalcitrant blogger or commentator, what can you do with your regulation? Especially when it is about the right thing, which is not terrorism, which is not child pornography, where many countries will cooperate with you. But here we are talking about the right thing in terms of certain types of speech. And I'm wondering whether Singapore government will, in the end, have another piece of legislation which doesn't have, it may have the bark but no bite.
Minister, your response?
Well, like I said, I think the regulations largely deal with the news sites. I think in terms of whether
but, cross-border...
understand.
Yeah.
So that's an area which I think, I'm not sure it's that easy to, in fact, even try to regulate. Yeah. Because that's why it's a very amorphous space, which is why my point is I think you can't control it, but I think you need to see where it makes sense, some form of light regulation, and that's why we are applying it to local news sites. Now, whether it could actually even be practically extended beyond the borders, I think that's a different ball game altogether, and that actually might not be possible. But that's something that we need to explore, and we'll see how that
I've got 3 minutes left only. I'm just going to take a quick phone call, and if we have time, we'll come back to this. Your question to our next caller. Hello there. Chi Wat.
Yes.
Chi Wat, you're my final caller. Go ahead.
Find out if the minister can go on air now and give us the assurance that the government won't ever classify blogs and individual websites as news sites, and that these will never come under a regulation.
Chi Wat, are you a blogger by any chance?
No, I'm not.
Not a blogger. Okay, well, let's talk to that. Minister, is that something that we can say for certain? We know that it was a blog post, a Facebook post. Will it be ensconced in the wording?
Well, I think, like I said, the regulations deals with news sites. It doesn't encompass blogs. But would some blogs become news sites? And then if it evolves to become news sites, I think that's something that we need to look at. But as a broad principle, it's meant to cover those that are reporting news. Individual blogs, commentaries, that remains open.
Unless it morphs into a news site?
If it morphs into a news site, then I think that's something that we have to look at. But otherwise, in the main, most of these blogs, most of these commentary pages, I think they remain as it is, and they will not be captured under regulations.
When is it a news site?
I think when it actually aims at reporting on a regular basis news in Singapore, I think we're provided for some of that. And MDA has, as a regulator, would have to assess.
Has to decide.
But I think the idea is to actually look at those who are reporting in the main news in Singapore. The rest, many of the blogs are commentaries. They have an active interest in local affairs. But I think those don't particularly come under that definition of news sites per se.
Last minute.
Right. I want to weigh in on Minister Yacob's side on this thing called the right thing. I think what he meant, if you read the full quote, is that it's got to be the right thing and that it's not false. It's attributed, it's sourced, it's verified.
Responsible journalism.
Which is responsible journalism, professional work. Rather than the right thing to read in terms of type or type to read. Now, I think that's a good point. And I think even those on the online community has to be fair about that. That those are the practices that should be put in place.
Take the quote in its full context, especially.
Okay, that's one. But, in all other respects, there's some professionalism to be injected if they report on news. The big question, though, is whether this current scheme is the way to do it.
On that note, thank you to all my panelists. I really appreciate you joining us. Let's see a final look at how our poll is standing right now. Will the new licensing rule limit online news content? 73.6 saying yes and 26.4 saying no. You can keep on voting, of course, at our poll at channelnewsasia.com/TP. And you can leave your comments on our Facebook page, have your say, and also tweet us at TP Vote. We hope we were able to answer at least some of the questions with regard to how this new licensing scheme will affect us all. And of course, you can catch up for the encore editions on our Facebook page, on our website as well, the microsite, channelnewsasia.com/TP. Thank you for watching. I'm Daniel Martin, and this has been Talking Point. Good night, everybody.